Hello and welcome to Chaotic Insights, where I break down the TV show Chaotic, and today we will be talking about Season 3, Episode 1, Perithon. So grab a snack, start your laundry, and we'll dive right in with the episode summary. The four tribes in the Tribal Alliance decide to have a race to celebrate defeating the Marillions. Peyton and Kaz end up as drivers in the race, while Tom and Sarah port around Param to spectate. Every tribe bends the rules a little bit and tries to cheat during the race, and Peyton and Kaz make it to the finish line first, creating an argument that breaks out between the tribe leaders, signifying the end of the tribal alliance. So, analysis, that's the episode we're working with, and this is a fun, straightforward episode. We really have one plot line, and that is the Perithon race. And we zoom in and out of Kaz and Peyton's experience and the race at large. We lay exposition for this episode in a couple ways. One is through Tom and Sarah's just initial conversation, and they talk about that they are throwing the race to celebrate defeating the Merlions, and that there is no prize. They are competing for the honor of the Alliance, which really just means bragging rights, and that establishes the stakes of the competition, like what are the stakes? You get bragging rights. And so whoever wins will bring honor to their tribe. And then Nadrin also helps us lay exposition here by announcing the race, announcing the racers, explaining the rules, and telling us about the course. And the tone of this episode is celebratory, like the titular Marillion invasion has come to a close, and it's no longer the titular Marillion invasion because we have indeed switched out the title. But this is really acting kind of as a conclusion for the last season, and everybody's happy. They've overcome this like great ordeal, and everybody is feeling joyous and together. And this episode is truly a race episode, which is a twist on the format of Chaotic, because Chaotic is like, I like to say fantasy wrestling. A race is a race. And so seeing this different form of competition used at Chaotic is different than what we normally see, but it still feels within the bounds of the universe. We're still watching a competition take place in the competition show, it's just a different kind. And I think that's interesting, and I think they're mixing it up, right? But once again, we are in Param with no drone battle in sight, so this is really a Param story. And do the Chaotic players have all that much of an impact on this story itself? Not necessarily. They just like happen to be in the thick of it again. They happen to be in the mix, and then like they have an impact on the end because Kaz and Peyton win, but like they don't really impact what the tribes do to each other or how the argument sparks, because it's like what happens with Relum and what happens with Prantix and the parasites and the War Beast, right? All of these different aspects of like bending the rules, cheating, that's what really causes the end of the alliance. And once again, our humans are spectators to that. Now, this episode really does have an important job for the overarching story of the Marillion invasion, and that's to provide a little bit of resolution to that story. We don't really see any falling action in the last season because like we get the climax and then we kind of like start to see falling action, but then they're like, I guess that's how Byram is gonna be. And this episode really solidifies like what that resolution is and establishes a new status quo, right? Because that's what the resolution, that's what the denouement does, right? It wraps up all the issues and establishes a new status quo. So in this episode, they're establishing the unity between the tribes as the new status quo after the Marillion invasion. And then we have the plot of this episode, right? And they're telling us that the Marillion invasion is over, and here we have an exciting incident that breaks this newly formed status quo, and this episode like resolves by establishing the new status quo, which is similar to how everything started, the disagreement between tribes, right? So this episode does two things. It establishes the new status quo after the Marillion invasion is tribal unity, celebratory, being together, right? They overcame their differences and now it's one big happy family. But on the flip side of that, it immediately undoes all of that. We go back to the status quo that exists like before the Marillion invasion ever started, except this time we've learned things along the way. And so this sets us up for our oncoming season, where the tribes are once again at odds, but they're in our tribal friendships, or like, we've learned some lessons along the way of we're not at each other's throats so much. Like, It's really not enemies. There's some individual relationships like that, and the tribes as a whole still have conflict, but it's, kind of chipped away at of now there's some interpersonal friendships between the tribes because they've gone through battle together. And there's some social progress that has been made, but this episode really shows the progression from like friendly competition to rivalry to conflict through the leaders' reactions of the Underworld Coliseum. And they're commentating on the race, and you see that progression of, right, the status quo is we're all here together to celebrate, and we've overcome our differences. And actually, you cheated. Actually, you cheated. And now there's tension, there's rivalry. It goes from friendship and friendly competition to rivalry, right? Still friendly competition, but they're kind of egging on each other. And that rivalry turns back into the conflict that once was. And really, that's how this episode works in the grand scheme of things, right? It concludes one story and it begins another. It's that bridge. And I would say it's a really good starting episode for a season, right? If we compare this to season two, where it's like, I disagree where that episode break is, where the seasons change, but that's just like where the animations changed. Here, it feels intentional. It feels like the last episode of season two is intentionally a turn into falling action, and this episode is intentionally the start of something new. And that's what you want from the first episode of a season, or at least that's what I want. So let's move on to lore. And things we learn in this episode is the tribes did beat the Marillions. They did that, right? We don't see it with our eyes, but we learn that they did that, and that, there's some progress there along the way. We also learn some things when Nadrin welcomes all four tribes and visitors from Chaotic in his like welcome speech for the race. And this is actually a big thing for this episode. It shows the development from where we started in the series to now, and not with the creatures with each other, but with the creatures and humans, right? The creatures were originally distrustful of humans, and now humans are being openly welcomed to share space and share in the celebration with the creatures. And I think this is the first time we've seen like a mixed crowd of creatures and humans in the show. And it makes sense that for an episode where they're embracing unity, togetherness, they put aside their differences for this common goal, they're also extending that olive branch to the humans, right? They learned these lessons and now they're applying it to the relationship with the humans, not just their relationship with other creatures. And, they're being welcoming and they're following the lessons that they learned from the war. But this is really solidified further with Kaz and Peyton. The creatures don't know that they like entered the race, but they go to win the race, and when it's revealed, Kaor claims Kaz for the underworld, right in front of all of Param. Despite them competing for a Mopedian creature, Yeteria, Kaor still sees Kaz, knows his relationship with him, and in front of all of Param says, yes, I know this human and we're friends, and he's one of us, right? Kaz is an underworlder. He stands for the underworld, and that's like an exciting development of, before Kaor's relationship with Kaz has been that, just like an individual relationship, and here he's putting it on display in front of all of Param. And so it goes on to normalize and accept like having human friends without shame, and it normalizes, right, trusting humans, which combats that original concept that we were introduced to that creatures are distrustful of humans. And here we see the complete opposite of that. We see Kaor is trustful of a human. And so with it normalized and accepted, right, we've seen this arc happen, and that's part of this new status quo I think that we're establishing, and that, you know, humans are guests in Param. They're no longer hostile intruders. And like, sure, different humans, like, you can't judge a whole group by some individuals. So there are going to be some outliers here, but as a whole, the relationship with creatures and humans has been on the up and up. It's been mended, and that's like a big development. Other things we learn, there's a giant crystal TV in the Coliseum. I'm assuming that was installed just for this race so that they could watch, but that's something that like we knew the overworld had a giant crystal, viewing globe situation. Now we know the underworld has it, so that's, creates some balance. And we also learn a little bit about the course, which gives us insight onto the map of Param. And so the course was through the overworld to the Mepedian Desert, down to the Danian homeland and then to Underworld City, which that makes sense already because we knew, right, Mepedians and Overworlders were above and Danians and Underworlders were below the surface. And so that course itself makes sense, but we learned some things in there. So what we see through the overworld, we see skeletal springs into the riverlands, which are still polluted from the Marillions, right? Nature hasn't healed itself that quickly. And so it's still kind of gray and brown water, which, is unfortunate, but makes sense canonically. And so from Skeletal Springs to the Riverlands to the Mepedian Desert, we learn about Zizark Tunnel, which connects the Mepedian Desert to the Danian homeland. This is new information, right? So we learn that those are connected. We knew the overworld and the underworld were connected in several different places, but now we get a concrete connection from Mepedians to Danians. Now, after Zizark Tunnel, they make it to the Danian homeland, which of course is Mount Pillar at this time, to Underworld City. And to Underworld City, they pass through Fear Valley, and then the entrance of Underworld City kind of looks sculptural, it kind of looks like Kaor, and then they go to the Colosseum. And so we learn that, like, Fear Valley is in between Underworld City and Mount Pillar, and we learn that the Riverlands are in between Skeletal Springs and the Mepedian Desert, right? So it just gives us some geographic sense of Param, and so if you're looking to create a map, here's some information that'll help you out. And then the final thing that we learn in this episode is parasite projectors, which is a battle gear that Danians have to spread parasites. In the past, we have seen parasites just organically through Rasnus, right? He does it like an attack. But here they have a battle gear specifically for that. And so it raises questions of like, are the parasites like loaded in there? Are they still an organic material? Or is a parasite like an attack? A liquilizer creates its attack, whereas like does a parasite projector do the same thing? And also this seems dangerous, right? The parasite projectors, they didn't really have good aim in this episode. They didn't hit any of the creatures and like successfully turn any creatures into Danians, but it expands the danger in which Danians can inflict. It's the difference between one parasite, which is like an individual attack, and then like an attack of mass destruction, which is a ton of parasites, right? They could really inflict damage by like shooting it at the crowd and creating a lot of Xanian creatures, which is interesting. Moving on to fun facts and other notes, right? On that same kind of topic, we do see one creature that has turned into a Danian, but he was competing for Danians the whole time and wasn't turned mid-race, and that was Hammerdune. So we see Hammerdune assimilated, and it's fun to see Hammerdune again, but this time he's competing for the Danians and he looks like a bug. And so this makes sense with the card lore because we have a Hammerdune assimilated card, but we don't see this on screen like we see some of the other transformations. And right, it follows that lore from the card, and incorporating that into the TV show is cool. And so we learned that sometime between the last time we saw Hammerdune, which was before the doors of the Deep Mind opened, and after they defeat the Marillions, right? Sometime in between the introduction and the defeat, Hammerdune got turned into a Danian by a Danian parasite. And so that's like lore and interesting, but it also connects to the cards. Now, some other fun facts and other notes I wrote down. Road Rager 7 is a video game that Kaz plays in the real world, gives us some real world lore. Kaz tried out for the track team and it went poorly, also gives us some insight onto the real world. But this episode really, it does a great job highlighting creatures and battle gear and locations, specifically the racers and their vehicles, right? Nadrin points out every single racer and every single vehicle, and it really highlights the variety of battle gear and the variety of creatures there are. And these are all creatures that you can have cards for. And it strengthens that connection that we've been talking about of, right, when you see a card on screen, it strengthens your connection to that card because it establishes that, like, this is a real creature in this world. And so, like, if you pull out a creature in the deck that you've seen in the TV show, right, it's good synergy. It makes you excited versus if you pull a card that you've never heard anything about or you've never seen before, that's a different experience. And so solidifying all of those creatures into this first episode is a good business strategy, and it's good synergy with the cards. We have one more thing here, and it's the theme song. So the clips changed for season 3, and also we get a new title card, which is Secrets of the Lost City. And so I'm interested to talk about what the Lost City is and what secrets it might hold. We know Param holds so many secrets, but it signifies a definitive change from the Merlian invasion to that we're onto something new. And I think that's exciting and I think that's cool. So my final thoughts of this episode are this is a fun time. It's an easy episode to watch, and it still progresses the overarching story. As a kid, I thought this episode was kind of like a cheap trick to revert the like world back to what it was before the invasion, right? To reset the tribal conflict and regress Param back to what it was before. But now, this time watching, I didn't have that same issue with it. I thought the celebratory tone really like drew me in. But also, I think progress isn't linear, and so even though the creatures in Param took a step back in this episode, like it shows that they still like harbor the prejudice that they had before the invasion, and even though they took a step forward, they're not all the way there, and it takes time to unlearn that. And so I think using the race as a way to slip back into their learned behavior has a little bit more realism in it than I originally thought, but also like it is a narrative ploy to reset the stakes, and I think we have to acknowledge that. But it's a straightforward episode, and it's fun to exist in the world, and it's fun to see chaotic. So, all in all, yeah. Let me know what you think, if there's anything I missed, and thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.